Hello and welcome to Fire of Learning. I'm Justin. In 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire fell to Germanic invaders. However, the eastern half of the empire did not suffer the same fate. At least, not immediately. For another 1,000 years, the Eastern Roman Empire, often called the Byzantine Empire, endured. For a time, it was even believed that the East would be powerful enough to bring the old empire back to the West. Some Byzantine rulers would strive toward this very goal, the most successful by far having been Justinian I, though in the end, they each failed. The light of Rome was nearly extinguished following the reign of Justinian I as Byzantium was hit by numerous challengers. Persians, Arabs, Slavs, Bulgars, Norsemen, and the Frankish king who dared to call himself Emperor of Rome. Still, Rome did not give up. It crawled out of this dark age in the 9th century and remained a power in its own right for centuries after. But for how long could this last exactly? In this video, we will begin at the reign of Basil I and explore the brighter period that was taking root in the empire. But as we continue, we will watch this period grow darker for the empire, until finally, the mighty Roman Empire is forced to make a heroic last stand in 1453. Before we begin, I would like to thank Alan Willard, Brent, Ethan Fotou, Quinn Parsons, Rolf Reich-Peterson, Alok G. Singh, and Patrick for being our most recent supporters on Patreon, as well as all these individuals who have become patrons since our last documentary. They join these supporters who make these videos possible. Our last documentary, The History of the Byzantine Empire, covered the history of the empire from 476 to 867 AD, ending with the beginning of the reign of Basil I, our current starting point. It's not necessary to watch that documentary to understand this one, but if you enjoy this, I would recommend it, as well as the two preceding Rome documentaries. Now, Basil I, a wrestler from Macedonia of all things, became Emperor of Rome in 867 AD after befriending, tricking, and then killing the prior emperor, Michael III. His reign marks the beginning of the Macedonian dynasty, the most successful dynasty in Byzantine history. He would rule until 886. Throughout his reign, he began reforming law in what is called the Basilica, though this was something his successor would more effectively finish. He introduced new laws, some of which stripped the Byzantine Senate of nearly all of the little power it retained. The Senate of Constantinople was among the last aspects of the empire tying it to its Roman Republican past. It was now beginning to look much more like a medieval kingdom. There would be few matters in which the emperor was limited, one of those matters of course being matters of religion. Basil also waged war on the Arabs. Forces from the Muslim states which had arisen in the former territory of the Byzantine Empire were a constant threat to much of Europe overall. Many areas of Europe that were spared from Viking raids had to deal instead with these Muslim raiders, often called Saracens. Raids occurred yearly in accordance with requirements for holy war. Byzantine outposts were sacked, Romans were taken as slaves, people were killed, and land, such as the island of Sicily, had been and was being lost. However, the Abbasid Caliphate was beginning to fracture. The tables would soon be turning. Basil I's rule was successful. The empire was, frankly, becoming the strongest and most stable it had been in centuries. His personal life, however, was not so successful. As he aged, he retained his aggressiveness and became paranoid. Much of this was directed at his son, Leo. Leo was possibly not Basil's son, but rather the son of the former emperor, Michael III. It's not clear, historians still disagree, but rumor persisted nevertheless. Basil abused Leo and attempted to prevent his ascension, though he failed. When Basil died, Leo came to the throne as Leo VI in 886. He would be remembered as Hosophos, Leo the Wise. He reigned until 912. His reign was among the less successful ones of the Rebound era. In fact, it was not very successful. The wars against the Muslim states were constant, and now conflict with Bulgaria came as well, under their king Simeon I the Great in 894. Simeon had become king the year prior, and is remembered as one of the most important rulers of early Bulgaria. The Bulgarian victory in this war was decided at the Battle of Bulgarophygon in 896. Byzantium had to cede territory to Bulgaria and recognize the independence of Serbia. In 902, Sicily finally fell to the Arab invaders as the last Byzantine outpost was captured. In 904, the Arabs sacked the city of Thessalonica, ruining much of the city and taking a large chunk of the population as slaves and prisoners. All the while, Leo was forced to consider the notion of marrying a fourth wife, a heretical prospect in the East. His past wives had died of disease, and he still had no son. Despite these failures, Leo did have some successes, one of which was a revenge strike on the Arabs. In 910, he sacked the city of Laodicea. He then planned an invasion to retake the island of Crete, but Arab forces destroyed the Byzantine fleet he sent, and Leo died not long after, in 912. In 913, the throne passed to his young son Constantine VII, though his mother, Leo's wife, Zoe Carbonopsina, would be one of a number of regents ruling in Constantine's reign. Constantine was known as Porphyrogenitus, the Purple-born, a title that would be given to many successive rulers to highlight their legitimacy. That same year, Simeon and the Bulgarians invaded again. This almost resulted in yet another siege of Constantinople. However, the city's defenses he found were too daunting, and so he settled on raiding the countryside until the Romans agreed to his terms, one of which included Constantine marrying one of Simeon's daughters. Zoe refused these plans, and war resumed. It was brutal warfare, and it included one of the largest battles of medieval history, Achelous, where the disorganized Byzantines were crushed and routed by Simeon. Zoe was deposed by a naval commander from Armenia named Romanos Lycopanos in 919, who forced her into a convent. Lycopanos now held the reins of the government. Importantly, though, he did not challenge the now 14-year-old Constantine VII's rule officially. Instead, he acted as his co-emperor, or regent. Breaking up dynasties was a messy business, after all. Why do it if it's not necessary? Simeon made peace with the Romans in 924 and died in 927. He was succeeded by his son Peter, who was much easier for the Byzantines to work with. Stability was now coming back to the Balkans. However, it had come at great cost. The Bulgarian Empire now stretched across most of the Balkans, from modern Ukraine to Greece. In 934, the city of Melitene in eastern Anatolia was captured by the Byzantine general Kourkouas. This city had been Muslim for centuries, and its capture signaled a coming shift in power in the region, a welcome change to the Byzantines after centuries of struggling to hold on to whatever they could. However, as this was going on, the Byzantines held on deeply to the ancient Roman tradition of being attacked on one front while busy on another. The great city of Constantinople itself was attacked, once again by a group of these strange Norse Slavic warriors, the Rus, who sailed down the river systems of modern Russia to the Black Sea. The Rus invasion failed. Evidently, they were unprepared for the infamous Greek fire, which incinerated them and their ships. Interestingly, though, after these events, the two sides established better relations, the beginning of a relationship which would be significant in the future of both peoples. In 944, the Romans took the city of Edessa, as well as part of Mesopotamia. It was in this year, however, that Romanos' sons deposed him. In turn, Romanos' sons were deposed by the people of Constantinople. In summary, this finally left Constantine VII as full emperor. The problem was, he had grown used to sitting on the sidelines and allowed his officials to carry on administration for him, while he named his son, with Romanos' daughter, Romanos II, as his co-emperor, and therefore heir. The reign of Constantine VII produced two remarkable generals, Nikephoros Phocas and his nephew, John Tzimiskes. These two generals pressed ever further into Arab lands. In 961, Nikephoros Phocas went so far as to retake the island of Crete. He then sacked Aleppo in Cilicia. Years later, in 965, the Byzantines would oust the Arabs from Cyprus and regain naval supremacy in the eastern Mediterranean. Nikephoros was making quite a name for himself. He was a cold, simple, deeply religious man, frankly an ascetic, yet a brilliant military commander. Before long, he earned the moniker, the Pale Death of the Saracens, a reference to how supposedly ghostly pale the Arabs would become in sight of this man. In 963, such a reputation came in handy when the Emperor Romanos II died. He was only 26, and his sons were too young to succeed him. Romanos' wife, seeking to secure their position, married the popular Nikephoros, who became another regent holding the true power. As emperor, Nikephoros continued his success in the east, but then naturally trouble came to the Balkans yet again, as relations between Bulgaria and the Byzantines broke down yet again. Because Nikephoros was busy in the east, he invited Kievan Rus to invade Bulgaria from the north. Naturally, this plan also spun out of control, and in 969, the Rus effectively controlled half of Bulgaria, and had been so successful that they continued expanding further, ruining Nikephoros' plan entirely and expanding into Byzantine territory. Vikings, what do you expect? In 969, Nikephoros Phocas died. He was a great military commander, but a harsh leader as well, and had become disliked by the people. He was killed in his sleep. His assassin? None other than his own nephew, John Tzimiskes. The charismatic Tzimiskes became the lover of Nikephoros' wife and became the regent emperor himself that year. These men were willing to challenge and kill each other. However, they were not willing to challenge the Macedonian dynasty. The heir apparent was still the young Basil, the son of Romanos II. John I Tzimiskes now got to enjoy the bundle of fun that was foreign relations of the age. His first task was handling the Rus, which he did in the Battle of Arcadiopolis in 970. The Rus were driven back, and the Byzantines actually ended up annexing more territory than they had lost. Still, the situation in the Balkans was far from stable. The Bulgarians remained an issue, and would for decades. The following year, John traveled to fight in the east, though he would die here in 976. Finally, the throne returned to the Macedonian line itself, and Basil II came to the throne. Basil II would not be another one of these short-lived emperors, nor an emperor easily pushed around. In fact, he would be the longest reigning emperor in Byzantine history, from 976 to 1025. With all this time and opportunity, Basil was set for an eventful and ultimately successful reign. But it would not be an easy one, nor a peaceful one, as is foreshadowed by his famous sobriquet, Basil the Bulgar Slayer. When power first came to Basil II at the age of 19 in 976, he did not seem like a ruler who was truly prepared to handle it. Accordingly, he allowed his ministers to handle the affairs of the day, though he would watch keenly from the background, learning how to rule. His early reign was marked by rebellion and civil war, which ravaged the empire. The first rebellion was put down by a general named Bardas Phocas in 979, though Basil himself was taken to the field to help handle these affairs personally as well. In 985, Basil wrested control of the empire from his ministers, and became full emperor, taking the reins of his reign. However, he still had to prove himself. The people of the empire had gotten used to being ruled not simply by the hereditary monarch, but by whomever could take power. Granted, merit was always important to the Romans, but coups were not the preferred method of proving yourself. Anyhow, Basil was prepared. In 986 he invaded Bulgaria, and went to war with their Tsar, Samuel. The Bulgarians had to be dealt with, and it was an opportunity to prove himself. The war was a humiliating defeat. At the Battle of the Gates of Trajan, Basil's army was destroyed, and he barely escaped. The Bulgarians then began advancing into Byzantine territory, taking many areas in modern Greece, and going as far south as Corinth. Failure caused the Roman officials to lose faith in their new emperor, and plotting commenced again. This time, in 987, the general who had ended the past rebellion, Bardas Phocas, now turned against the emperor himself. With his reign on the line, to quell this rebellion, the assistance of mercenaries was required, and the men who arrived on the scene would make a lasting impression. In the West, these types of warriors who arrived were called Vikings. In the East, however, the same group were called Varangians, from the Old Norse Varingir, meaning faithful companions. The Rus sent 6,000 of these top troops to be placed under Basil's command. In exchange, the Grand Prince of Kiev, Vladimir, took Basil's sister's hand in marriage. For the marriage to take place, however, the Rus had to convert. Thus, importantly, this is the origin of Russia's conversion to Christianity, and its cultural ties to Eastern Rome. In 989, Basil finally met up with Bardas Phocas. While the two sides prepared for battle, Bardas Phocas decided to challenge the Emperor Basil to single combat, a duel, to decide who would wear the crown. Basil accepted. Bardas prepared for this fight, mounted his horse, and then began to move towards Basil, confident of victory. A man-to-man duel was about to occur for the throne of the Empire of Rome. Then, in full view of everyone, before reaching Basil, Bardas paused, had a seizure, and died. Across history, the true will of God was often a subject of debate. In this circumstance, there was not much debate. The rebel army began to panic and broke. Basil was victorious, and now had the destiny of the empire in his hands. He was a naturally raucous, suspicious, and mean person, and these experiences only intensified his negative personality traits. Still, he had big plans, and was as dedicated of a leader as they come. He soon turned his attention to restoring the integrity of the empire and expanding its borders and influence. The Arabs, specifically the Fatimid Caliphate, had used the Byzantine weakness to extend their own influence and reverse the past Byzantine conquest, which Basil would not stand for. In 994, Basil rode out to meet them. He rode hard. He mounted his entire army and caught the Arabs by surprise, moving the army to Aleppo in just 16 days. Though the Arabs were stronger, they were completely taken by surprise and were forced to retreat. War continued for the rest of the decade, but a long truce was signed in the year 1000 AD. Now, the emperor could turn his attention toward his true enemy, and it was personal. Basil immediately struck back hard at the Bulgarians, capturing a sizable amount of territory by the following year. He entered the region with a plan to fight a war of attrition, attacking Bulgarian fortifications, but also pillaging the countryside to deprive them of resources. It was a good start. Past emperors had only dreamed of such success, but the Bulgarians, a strong and proud people, would not be easily tamed. As the years progressed, it became clear to Tsar Samuel that he would be fighting a defensive war. By 1010, much of Bulgaria was under Byzantine rule. On the 29th of July, 1014, the two sides met at the Battle of Clydon. Much was decided here. Basil was once more triumphant. Almost the entire Bulgarian army sent there was killed or captured. Tsar Samuel himself barely escaped. With these thousands of prisoners in his hands, Basil portrayed both his cruelty and cleverness. Instead of executing them, he divided them into groups of 100, and blinded all except every 100th man. This one man out of every 100 was left with one eye in order to lead his comrades home. The thousands of blinded soldiers were then sent across the countryside, back to their leader. Basil knew thousands of blind men would require extra care to survive, which would put even more strain on the Bulgarians than if he executed them. As the thousands of men returned home, it is said that the Tsar Samuel was so overwhelmed at this sight, he had a heart attack and died. With Samuel dead, the Bulgarians lost even more hope of a defense. By 1018, they were finished. The whole of Bulgaria was incorporated into the Byzantine Empire, and the neighboring kingdoms of Serbia and Croatia then became vassals of Rome. Basil did not rest after this, however. Immediately after, he led more victorious campaigns against the Georgians and Armenians. At home, he rooted out corruption and attempted to check the power of the nobility. He became beloved by his soldiers and his people. In 1025, the restless emperor planned to retake Sicily, but he died before the invasion could get underway. He was among Byzantium's greatest rulers. The empire was the strongest and largest it had been in centuries. For a time, Byzantium truly seemed like the one holy empire of the earth that it claimed to be. However, when Basil died, it was not long before it became evident how dependent upon him the situation really was. Basil II never married. Thus, childless, the throne passed to his brother, Constantine VIII, in 1025. His 3-year reign is often regarded as the beginning of the corrosion of the Macedonian dynasty and its accomplishments. He ruled for 3 years, preferring to relax over taking matters seriously. He also had no sons, so the throne passed to his daughter, Zoe Porphyrogenita, and her new, weak husband, Romanos Aurgeros, or Romanos III, in 1028. The successive wave of rulers following him undermined the strength of the empire. Romanos himself accomplished little, and was likely eventually assassinated by his wife, Zoe. Zoe was undoubtedly traumatized by his death. She waited for hours after he died to remarry. She remarried the same day. Her new husband, Michael IV, became emperor in 1034 and reigned until 1041. His rule was somewhat better, though he left many of the affairs of his state in the hands of his brothers and ministers. All the while, his reign coincided with famine and conspiracy, and discontent began to stir, turning into rebellions. Amid these rebellions came Pecheneg raids. The Pechenegs had been separated from, and occasionally an ally of, Byzantium in the past, but with Bulgaria out of the picture, friction soon developed. They had to do their raiding somewhere. On the other side of the empire, Arabs began raiding the region again, though to his credit, Michael IV did largely suppress these foes, and was even able to invade Italy. Forces including perhaps the greatest of all the Varangians, Harald Hardrada, the famous future king of Norway, alongside Norman mercenaries and other Byzantine troops of course, were sent to Sicily, where they temporarily reconquered a number of cities from the Arabs as well as much of southern Italy. Italy was a politically fragmented area, now in a time of instability, which the Eastern Romans had always been keenly interested in retaking. But, at the end, events here did not turn out well for the Romans. In 1040, the Norman mercenaries betrayed the Romans and raised revolts throughout the peninsula. The conquests in Sicily were soon lost. Michael died of illness in 1041, and his nephew, Michael, succeeded him, but was removed by Zoe, castrated, and blinded. She married Constantine IX, who had reigned for 13 years, outliving Zoe from 1042 to 1055. In those 13 years, amid the general chaos of the age, major events took place. A few in particular were dark storm clouds passing over the empire that would not only change it forever, but in fact, foreshadow its doom. In 1045, the Romans expanded into Armenia, capturing the city of Ani. It was a great gain, but it brought the Romans into contact with a new, determined, and dangerous foreigner. Recent converts to Islam, originally hailing from the steppes of Eurasia, the Turkmen, the Turks. In a somewhat similar way as the Arabs before them centuries earlier, the Turks were a new power that took advantage of the fragmentation in the Middle East that had been going on for some time now. They swept through the region, within years already having control over much of modern Iran and Central Asia. It was not long before the Byzantines and these Turks soon met in battle, specifically the Battle of Kapatron. With reinforcements from Georgia, the Byzantines won the battle, but the Seljuk Turks did not suffer a major defeat. The two sides agreed to a peace the following year. However, it was not a universal peace. The Turks were not necessarily unified as a people into one nation at this time. Like many of the peoples of Central Asia, these Turks were a group of nomadic pastoralists who had invaded the region from the Eurasian steppes. The Seljuk Turks, under their leader Sultan Tugril, were attempting to form a state, but there were many tribes accompanying this migration who were only nominally subject to the will of the Seljuk Sultan. If only the Romans at the time could have seen into the future, how shocked they would have been to see what the descendants of these Turkmen would have in store for their empire. However, for now, there were other matters to tend to. Things on the other flank of the empire were not much better. As mentioned, the Normans, the descendants of Vikings who had settled in northern France, were causing a lot of problems in Italy, which had been Roman again since the days of Justinian. Soon these problems would become harder to manage, and the Normans would threaten the Byzantine position in Italy itself. It was also during the reign of Constantine IX that the Church of the East and the Church of the West had finally had enough of each other. For centuries, the two had had opposing views and practices, and for the most part, acted independently of each other. Tension was further inflamed by a number of events, such as the iconoclastic controversy and crowning of Charlemagne as Emperor of Rome. Though there were a number of theological disagreements, at the root of the split was a debate over authority. Was the Pope the head of the Christian Church as a whole, or was he one among various heads? Was he simply the Patriarch of Rome alongside figures such as the Patriarch of Constantinople and the Patriarch of Jerusalem? In 1054, debate over this issue reached the breaking point. After a brief ecclesiastical argument, the Western Church excommunicated the Eastern Church. In response, the Eastern Church excommunicated the Western Church. This event is known as the East-West Schism, or Great Schism. The people of Christendom did not react to this as strongly as one might expect. In fact, it was seen as a lesser issue of the day. Men of the cloth bickering with each other over issues that would surely be resolved within a few years. Surely this would not be a permanent divide that would have significant consequences for the Byzantine Empire beginning within just a few decades, right? Well, we'll see. Constantine IX died in 1055 and his sister-in-law Theodora the year after. After their deaths, the Macedonian dynasty came to an end. In the following 30 years, there would be 7 different emperors, each attempting to establish their own dynasty. Historians often compare the 11th century of Roman history to the 3rd century, in that it was a hectic period of disorder and instability following a relative period of success and stability. The throne was fought over, the currency was devalued, foreign enemies closed in on the empire, and things became darker. Such was the cycle of Rome. In 1060, a group of Normans under Robert Guiscard began to realize their ambitions of becoming the masters of southern Italy, taking the Byzantine city of Calabria. Later, on the other side of the empire by 1064, the Seljuk Turks, under their Sultan Alp Arslan, had grown immensely in power, and their borders now touched those of the Roman Empire itself. It was in this year that the Turks invaded Byzantine territory. The emperors of the age were failing to defend Italy from the Normans, who now owned most of the former Byzantine holdings there, set the stage for a Turkish invasion of Anatolia by neglecting the army, and had done little to stop the raiding in the Balkans. In 1067, the emperor at the time, Constantine X, died. His final wishes were for his sons to succeed him, and by his request, his wife took a vow to never remarry. When he died, she remarried. Seeing the need for a soldier emperor, the general Romanos Diogenes was brought to the throne through this marriage in 1067 as Romanos IV. Romanos began at once to work toward repelling the invaders, though he did not exactly have the best men for the job. The Byzantine army was in a very pathetic shape compared to its former days. It consisted mainly of ill-disciplined mercenaries from all over the world, a consequence of major neglect. Like late Western Rome, these soldiers did not have much loyalty to the empire. Rather, their loyalty was to each other and their paychecks. Regardless, he felt repelling the Turks would be a simple matter. He was wrong. By 1071, things were getting intense. In April of that year, the Normans seized Bari in Italy, bringing an end to Roman rule in the peninsula. Desperate for a decisive victory after this loss, Romanos pressed against the Turks further. In August, he met them by a city called Manzikert. The Turks offered Romanos a favorable peace agreement, but he declined, and so battle ensued. It was a catastrophic defeat for the Byzantines. Romanos was betrayed, both by mercenaries who defected to the enemy's side, and by a rival within his ranks, Andronikos Doukas, who, in the midst of the battle, knowingly lied and told his men that the emperor had died, and led 30,000 troops away. As the battle came to a close, Romanos IV was captured. The Turkish leader Alp Arslan had a hard time believing that the bloodied and dirty man before him was emperor of Rome, but when he confirmed it, he ceremonially placed his foot on his neck to symbolize his dominance. However, after this, he was famously respectful to the emperor and released him after exchanging a ransom and a peace agreement. When news of this reached the capital, however, the Byzantine government lost faith in Emperor Romanos and worked to depose him. After a brief civil war, Michael VII came to the throne, and Romanos was killed soon thereafter. The great irony of overthrowing Romanos IV was that his successors only worsened the situation. The Turks were really much more interested in their conflict with the Fatimids of Egypt, and might have ignored the Romans for the time being if Romanos had simply resumed his rule. But war resumed, war which would be catastrophic for the Byzantine Empire. As the empire was plunged into civil wars and rebellions, the Turks began to accomplish what the Arabs had failed to do. They broke through and advanced into Anatolia. In truth, they were partially invited into the region on many occasions by rebels seeking the throne with their help. Within the years following Manzikert, the Turks had overwhelmed the region and pushed the Romans to the outskirts of the peninsula. It is around this time that many Turkish invaders split off from the main Seljuk Empire and created the Sultanate of Rum, Rum being a corruption of Rome. By 1081, the empire was again facing death. Simply by seeing the Anatolian heart of the empire almost entirely under Turkish rule in such a short amount of time, one might expect that this could be the end of everything. Surely it would not be long until Constantinople itself was taken, and all would be lost. However, in the last moment, Rome found another emperor to save the day, Among its greatest, a 24-year-old general named Alexios Komnenos, who seized the throne in 1081. Alexios Komnenos got right to work to defend his empire from the enemies who were trying to divide it amongst themselves. He took the throne in April, and by October was prepared to deal first with the Normans. Having succeeded in Italy, the Normans, under Robert Guiscard and his son Bohemond, now moved into Roman Balkan territory. Alexios confronted them head-on and lost a number of engagements, but eventually began to win some. The true key here to victory was Alexios deciding to bribe the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV to attack the Normans in Italy, which forced him to retreat to defend their holdings there. He also recruited Venetian assistants, to whom he granted generous trading privileges in return. In 1085, Robert Guiscard died, and the Balkans were saved as activities slowed there afterward. This was not the end of the story between Robert's son Bohemond and Alexios, however. Next, the emperor turned to the north and east of the Balkans, where rebellions had popped up, and the Pechenegs were pressing further into imperial territory. The Pechenegs were allied to a warrior leader named Chakas, who was, in fact, the brother-in-law of the Sultan of the Sultanate of Rum and himself the ruler of Turkish Smyrna. This was a dangerous alliance, and it soon became clear that it could be a lethal one. They planned to besiege the great city itself in 1090. Here again, Alexios would save the day by combining his military and diplomatic talent, acquiring the aid of another Turkic tribe, the Cumans. 40,000 Cuman soldiers came to his aid at the Battle of Livonian in April of 1091, alongside other mercenaries as well. In this battle, the Pechenegs were crushed. Not only were the men defeated, but as a nomadic people confident of victory, many of the women and children had been brought along with them. The Romans and Cumans rode through their camp, slaughtering all in their path, killing and scattering up to 80,000 people. Unfortunately, as is Roman luck, the Cumans then seized the opportunity to fill the Pecheneg void, turned sides, and began raiding the Balkans themselves, though when their leader was assassinated, they left the region. All the while, a new sultan had taken power in the Sultanate of Rum, who waged war on Chakas and neutralized him as a threat. With these threats now gone, in 1094, Alexios could focus on handling the most troubled and bloody front of all, the East. Once more, Alexios would seek out foreign aid to deal with a menace which his own empire was in too poor of a shape to face on its own. Appealing to the West, specifically the Pope, with whom he was attempting to restore relations. He requested a small group of mercenaries to assist him, or something along those lines, in retaking former Roman lands. The Pope, Urban II, heard Alexios' concerns and in 1095 sent not simply a handful of warriors, but declared an entire crusade. The Church began drumming up support across Christendom to reclaim the Holy Land from the Muslim invaders, to retake the great Christian cities from the Turks, Antioch, Nicaea, Jerusalem especially, and to protect Constantinople from the same fate. The First Crusade had begun. Both peasant and noblemen took up the call across Western Europe. A number of things drew them to the east, but one of the main ones was simply that Deus Vult, God wills it. Tens of thousands of Western Catholic soldiers would soon be coming east via a route that took them through Constantinople. Not exactly what Alexios was wanting. He wanted a couple hundred mercenary knights. He got tens of thousands of Latins under their own leaders with their own agendas. Though Christian, the Byzantine Empire can best be thought of as a third party during the Crusades, at least the first three. It had much to gain from attacks on the Muslim invaders in its former regions, and would benefit greatly from these reinforcements. However, from the start, Alexios knew that these Westerners could not be trusted. The Romans found themselves in an awkward relationship with them, owed to the fact that they weren't true Christians in the eyes of the West. The leaders of the Crusades would not hesitate to turn on the Romans if a sufficient opportunity presented itself. Alexios knew this and did not forget it. The first Crusader army to arrive was an army of the lower orders, brought together by a priest named Peter the Hermit. These poorly disciplined troops ran out of food around halfway to the Holy Land and began to pillage the Byzantine Empire itself. As soon as they arrived into Constantinople, Alexios was all too happy to ship these poorly mannered guests of his empire into Anatolia. He told them, hey, you guys got this. Dropped them off, then returned to Constantinople, probably knowing full well that they did not got this. This army of 20,000 was annihilated at the Battle of Civitate before it gained much ground. However, fortunately for the crusade, the professional soldiers were on their way. One of the great leaders of these crusader armies was the Norman Bohemund, son of Robert Guiscard, on his way to rest in Constantinople, a fact about which Alexios was not very pleased, but he took what he could get. Though it was a burden to host such a large force of untrustworthy warriors, thankfully, the fact that the 60,000-strong army of crusaders needed to pass through Constantinople allowed the emperor some influence in the matter. He had the crusaders pledge to return the territory they had captured which had belonged to Rome back to Rome, or in other words, render unto Caesar that which used to be Caesar's. And in return, the crusaders would be granted funds, supplies, and aid, to which the crusaders half-heartedly agreed. Again, Alexios knew they couldn't be entirely trusted to do this, but he still hoped it would benefit the empire overall. Indeed, it did. The Crusades came at a time when the Muslim world, including the Turkish world, was fragmenting. In the late spring of 1097, as the crusade got going, the deal was upheld, and Nicaea was returned to the Romans. As the Crusaders claimed more land, though, it became clear that they would not be upholding their end of the bargain fully. In 1098, Baldwin of Boulogne captured the city of Edessa and made himself its count, the first of the independent Crusader states to arise in this time. Later that year, after a rough siege, Antioch then fell to the Crusader armies as well, and was not returned to Byzantium. Rather, the Principality of Antioch was proclaimed under the rule of Bohemond, Alexios' former rival. They justified this by claiming that the Byzantines had broken the agreement first by not aiding them at the siege of Antioch, and by limiting aid in general. But in truth, Alexios was rather unable to assist them in the siege, as he was busy reclaiming territory in Anatolia, and had even received false reports that the siege of Antioch had failed. Other Crusader states would form during and after the course of the First Crusade, which was considered a success on the part of the West, the most notable being the kingdom formed around the Grand Prize, Jerusalem. These states were referred to as the Overseas Lands, or Outremer in French. Alexios did not accomplish all he had hoped for, and though these crusaders were nominally his allies, he likely couldn't help but wonder to what extent he had traded unruly hostile Muslims with unruly hostile Latins. But he was now making important reconquests in Anatolia, ultimately benefiting from the affair. However, these crusaders became a bigger issue the following decade. Forces under Bohemond once again attacked the Balkans in 1107, but were defeated, and his Principality of Antioch became a vassal of the Byzantine Empire thereafter. Alexios continued his conquests in Anatolia even after the First Crusade had finished. In 1117, he engaged the Turks at the Battle of Philomelion. Here he was victorious, and the Turks sued for peace. Alexios Komnenos died in 1118. Despite his success, Anatolia still remained mostly Turkish. Regardless, the empire had been saved yet again, and Alexios had ushered in what historians refer to as the Komnenian Restoration. The crown then passed to his son, Ioannis, or John II, to carry on his father's work. Facing the innumerable enemies on the empire's frontier was no easy task, but John, like his father, was up to the challenge. Some historians, in fact, would rank the reign of John II the Good as even more successful than his father's. His first enemy was the Pechenegs, who returned to the frontier early in his reign in 1119. In the Battle of Beroia in 1122, John, alongside his Varangian guard, crushed the Pechenegs in this battle. So absolute was their defeat, in fact, that the Pechenegs began to disappear from history altogether after this. He would also fight Venetians, Hungarians, Serbs, the Crusaders, and Turks. He failed against the Venetians, but repelled the Hungarians, subjected the Serbians back to his rule, and won ground against the Turks of Anatolia. John's conquests returned the coasts and the west of the Anatolian peninsula back to the empire. He would also effectively force the Crusader states to recognize the power of Byzantium, and to respect, if not, in many situations, to serve under the Emperor of Rome. In his life, he would conduct over 20 sieges, personally leading the army in many circumstances. Having followed in his father's footsteps, he not only restored the territory of the empire, but also its integrity. He died in 1143, and was succeeded by his son, Manuel I. Standing on the foundations of his father and grandfather, Manuel would seek to finish the job and restore the mighty empire to what it had once been in the days of the Macedonians. His early reign was marked by the Second Crusade and the events preceding it. Before it began, he, naturally, was in conflict with the East, specifically the Sultanate of Rum and the Turkish Danishmendids. Manuel had a high opinion of the West, higher than his predecessors, and wanted to restore relations with them, going so far as to take Western wives. While campaigning, the Second Crusade was declared in Europe after the city of Edessa fell to Muslim forces in 1144, and the forces of Christendom began their march east. Again, though theoretically on the same side, the Byzantines prepared for hostility. Some pillaging and brief fighting did, in fact, break out between the Byzantines and the Latins, but Manuel managed to come to terms with them. The Second Crusade lasted from 1147 to 1150 and was a failure. The Crusaders immediately attempted to determine why, and ended up blaming the Byzantines for not reinforcing the crusade with enough troops or supplies. Manuel hadn't sabotaged the crusade, he was simply indifferent to it, but Byzantium was an easy scapegoat. The Crusaders, among them the future emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, Frederick Barbarossa, mocked what they called the Kingdom of the Greeks. This only exacerbated tension between the Byzantines and Western powers. Around the same time, the Byzantines were engaged against the Normans, who were again pillaging the Balkans and seeking assistance from the Serbs and Hungarians against their Roman foe. Fortunately, Manuel was able to repel these foes. He then turned his attention to Norman Sicily itself and attempted to invade the region once again. Though the Normans had left, Manuel would have trouble with the Balkans for decades after this, because of the trouble they had caused. Manuel's expedition into Norman Italy won the empire no territory. The empire, though still enjoying the high point brought about by the Komnenoi, just wasn't what it used to be. Never again would the Romans rule their homeland. Then, more trouble with another Italian power that had been a constant problem for the Byzantines came: Venice. In 1171, Manuel went to war and ordered that all Venetians throughout the empire be imprisoned and their property confiscated, partially because the Venetians and other Italian merchants in the city had become so troublesome. The Venetians responded, sending a fleet against the Romans, but their expedition failed. Manuel's reign, though overall successful, would end with a major setback. In 1176, war came with the Turks of the Sultanate of Rum once again. Manuel was determined to reclaim all Anatolia from his Turkish foes and finish the job begun by his grandfather. He moved to engage them, passing through the mountains of Anatolia at the head of a large army. On September 17, 1176, while passing through a narrow area of the mountains, his army was ambushed by Turkish forces at the Battle of Myriokephalon. Because of this ambush, the battle was a significant defeat, both for the Byzantine military and the larger national picture. It is said that Manuel was greatly affected by these events psychologically. In fact, the empire's mindset was greatly affected by these events. Though Manuel was able to build up troops again, which allowed him to defend his territory, the campaign was ruined because the Romans were unable to salvage the siege engines that they had brought along with them through the mountains and left. Manuel could not go back on the offensive against the Turks, and even after he died, Rome would never be on the offensive against the Turks again. Ever. Manuel died in 1180 AD, and the throne passed to his 11-year-old son, Alexios II. Alexios was overthrown soon after, however, by Manuel's cousin, Andronikos Komnenos. When Manuel died, the empire had fallen under the regency of his wife, Maria of Antioch, a Westerner, a Latin, and she showed favoritism to the Latin peoples in the city, who by now, once again, controlled much of its trade. The citizens of the empire resented Latins, and when Andronikos came marching through the city to seize power, he led them to overthrow the Latin empress in 1182. Inspired by this fervor, the citizens of Constantinople then began to attack the Latin areas of the city. In total, they would slaughter between 60 to 80,000 Western Catholics, the majority being Northern Italians, men, women, and children. The papal legate was beheaded, and his head was tied to a dog and dragged through the streets. The survivors were gathered up and sold as slaves to the Anatolian Turks. The now 14-year-old Alexios II and his mother were killed. These actions enraged the Western European powers. The Italian Normans sacked Durazzo and Thessalonica in response in 1185, killing well over 5,000 Greeks. Cyprus was lost when a member of the Komnenoi family rose up and declared its independence. Relations with Hungary broke down and Serbia once more pursued its independence. Kaiser Frederick Barbarossa even threatened to sack Constantinople itself. He would not do so, however, for two main reasons. Firstly, though he had cracked down on corruption, Andronikos became a tyrant and was overthrown in 1185 to be replaced by Isaac II Angelos, leading Frederick to lose interest. This was the end of the Komnenoi and the beginning of the Angelid dynasty. Andronikos was dragged through the streets, beaten and mutilated by the same crowd which had helped him seize power only a few years earlier. Secondly, there were now other matters to attend to, namely the Third Crusade, launched in 1189, 2 years after the events that encouraged it in the first place. In 1187, the Muslim Sultan of the Ayyubids, Saladin, had retaken the city of Jerusalem, prompting its declaration. Isaac II would rule from 1185 to 1195. In the same year as his ascension, while occupied with the Normans in the Balkans, an old foe seized a moment and rose up to restore itself: the Bulgarians. The Bulgarians, along with Vlachs and with Cuman support, rose up in response to harsh imperial taxes, proclaiming the Second Bulgarian Empire. In 1190, Isaac tried to stop them, but suffered a heavy defeat at the Battle of the Trivana Pass, leading Ivan Asen I to claim the throne as Emperor of Bulgaria. Amid this trouble closing in across the empire, many Romans wondered who would emerge to save the empire now. The Third Crusade ended in 1192, a partial success. Jerusalem remained in the hands of the Muslims, but they had gained some territory and accomplished some goals. Frederick Barbarossa had drowned in a river while on his way to this crusade, which the Byzantines weren't exactly sad to learn about. One notable territory that the Crusaders had captured was Cyprus. Richard the Lionheart had taken it from the independent governor, but he did not give it back. Instead, the Kingdom of Cyprus formed, and the island would never again be Roman. Things were beginning to look like they had in the past. In 1195, Isaac was deposed by his older brother Alexios, who became Alexios III. In response, Isaac's son fled to Germany to avoid being another victim of his uncle's coup. Though Barbarossa had died, Latin interest in doing something about a problem called Constantinople had certainly not died with him, and after the Third Crusade, the eyes of the Latins turned toward it once again. Their interest was not simply in sacking such a wealthy city that was no doubt enticing to all the powers at the time, but more importantly, removing what they called this kingdom of the Greeks from the picture would facilitate access to Outremer, allowing crusading armies to reach the area. It would expand the power of the church by removing these heretical, schismatic Christians, and even benefit trade. Regardless of these potential benefits, the Crusaders still had to find justification for such a venture, however. Byzantium, while not exactly friendly, was not exactly hostile. The two shared a Christian heritage, after all, albeit a fractured one, and it was not long before this that they had fought the same enemy. Furthermore, they might mess it up and inadvertently welcome a Muslim power into the region that could take the city and use it as a base to expand into Europe itself. Thus, the idea of taking Constantinople had been just an idea, something the Crusader leaders talked about but never really worked towards. Until the turn of the century. In the late 1190s, around the time that Isaac had been overthrown by Alexios III, who by the way was not doing any better as emperor, the Pope began calling for a Fourth Crusade. In 1199, a Crusader army was finally being organized. The plan was to take Egypt, the power base of the Ayyubid Caliphate, and then move north towards Jerusalem, the intended goal. The Venetians, under their Doge Enrico Dondolo, prepared a fleet to transport the estimated number of Crusaders to Egypt. A year later, when it was time to sail out, the arriving army consisted of only a third of what they told the Venetians it would be. Accordingly, they could not pay for all the ships themselves, and the Doge held them captive in Venice until they could find a way to come up with the funds. Eventually, the Venetians offered the Crusaders the opportunity to pay their debts by attacking rival cities along the Adriatic. The problem was that these cities were already Roman Catholic. The Pope was not one bit happy that a holy army of Christ was being used to attack Catholics for Venice's personal interests, and he even excommunicated the Crusaders, but this information was hidden from them as long as possible, and they went along with it. This did not solve the problem though, and much of the debt remained. However, an opportunity presented itself in a certain Byzantine nobleman hanging around in Europe. Alexios, son of the deposed Emperor Isaac, proposed that the Crusaders assist him in retaking his throne. In return, he offered to pay off their debts, assist them in Egypt, and even place the East under the authority of the Pope in Rome. It was agreed, and in July of 1203, an army of around 20,000 Crusaders and Venetians reached the walls of Constantinople, which was to be defended by around 15,000 Byzantine troops. No Greek fire would be used here, the recipe for it had been lost long ago. Around a week into the siege, Alexios III had given up and fled the city, taking much of the empire's treasury with him. The Crusaders took the city, but were surprised to find that the Romans had already recrowned the blind past emperor, Isaac II, and were hostile to Alexios. In order to guarantee their payment, however, the Crusaders forced them to crown Alexios as Alexios IV, co-emperor to Isaac. Isaac died in 1204, complicating matters further. Alexios IV found himself unable to pay his debts, and resorted to melting down religious and historical icons to pay them. This outraged his own people, and combined with the fact that he was in cahoots with the Pope, led to rioting. He was willing to sacrifice his empire's soul for his own power. The Roman Senate, though largely powerless by this time, in one of their last great acts, attempted to depose him, and soon a nobleman named Mourtzouphlos overthrew Alexios IV, strangling him to death. Mourtzouphlos, who is now Alexios V, a firm anti-Latin, prepared to face the Crusaders head-on. Battle came once again. The Crusaders were tired of waiting for their money. It was now the spring of 1204. The Romans looked once more to someone who would save them, but found they had to face the cold reality that they would not be saved. I mentioned in the past that of the many times that Constantinople was besieged by foreigners, it would only fall twice. This was the first time. On April 13th, the city fell, and the Crusaders pillaged, raped, and murdered across the city, destroying much of it, even churches and religious sites. Ancient Roman works and artifacts were destroyed, and the Byzantine Empire itself succumbed to the Latin invaders. Constantinople was lost. As the Byzantine Empire was taken over, it certainly seemed like it was the end. But it was not. The Byzantine Empire was divided into various states in the Partitio Terrarum Imperii Romaniae, the partitions of the lands of the Roman Empire. Like with the Levant over a century earlier, the Latin Empire centered around Constantinople under Baldwin I arose, alongside other Crusader states such as the Kingdom of Thessalonica and Duchy of Athens. The Venetians also took many of the surrounding islands. After they finished arguing with each other over territory and rule, these Crusader states would grow and develop in the immediate years following the sack. However, the empire was not entirely taken over by the Crusaders, and a number of Byzantine rump states remained. The Despotate of Epirus, the Empire of Nicaea, and the Empire of Trebizond still remained. Though these three rump states that had arisen had difficulty cooperating with each other on account of the fact that the three separate rulers each claimed to be the single emperor, over the next few decades they would, slowly but surely, reclaim the empire from the unstable feudal Crusader states. Like those in the Levant, these states had not won the approval of the locals, and could not receive enough support from mainland Europe to maintain themselves, making them easy prey for more cohesive powers, not simply the Romans, but groups like the Bulgarians as well. It is also in this complicated time that a new player came riding into the scene to complicate matters even further. Around the 1240s, the Mongols came through. They were busy forging the second largest empire in human history. This unstoppable wave of conquest and destruction finally reached Eastern Europe and the Near East. Once the Mongols defeated the Hungarians, the Balkans were soon ravaged. Bulgaria was forced to pay tribute, and the Latin empires suffered as well. The Mongols were also found in the east, ravaging and conquering the Turks. The Byzantine rump states prepared for an invasion, but then opened their eyes to find that while everyone around them had suffered, they were largely left alone. This made the Latin downfall inevitable. In 1261, the Romans reconquered Constantinople under a leader named Michael VIII Palaiologos. The Palaiologos dynasty would revive the Byzantine Empire and attempt to restore it to what it had once been. However, for the time being, the other two splinter states would remain separated from the empire. The map at this point, showing a reunited Byzantine Empire, may not be what it seems, especially as the decades pass. Constantinople was greatly weakened, and many of the outside provinces of the empire had been acting independently. The city gradually became more and more distant from the rest of the empire. Though the Byzantines were back in purple, the Latins had not given up entirely and were interested in reviving their old Latin empire, which Michael VIII would spend much of his reign guarding against. To prevent this, Michael VIII would make a bold move. He would, to the chagrin of his people, rejoin the Catholic Church, submitting religiously to the Pope. It was a costly move, and it would be reversed by his successors, but it did its job. How could a crusade against Catholics be sanctioned by the Pope? Michael VIII died in December of 1282, likely having saved the empire from total annihilation. He was succeeded by his son Andronikos II. Throughout Andronikos II's reign, Anatolia would slowly be lost. The Mongol presence collapsed there, and a number of fragmented Turkish beyliks would arise in the region. One of those beys was Osman I, who gave the name to his beylik, the Osmani, or the Ottomans. Osman would prove himself to be a brilliant commander and began conducting raids into Byzantine territory, which Andronikos attempted to stave off. At the Battle of Baphaeus, however, the Byzantines were crippled, opening the door for future Ottoman expansion into the region. Like their Western Roman predecessors, the Eastern Romans, as their empire began to show signs of collapse, would rely more and more on mercenaries, in this case, Catalans from modern-day Spain. The plan of hiring these Catalans, however, would soon backfire. Unable to make a sufficient amount of profit from their mercenary work, they began to plunder the Byzantines, eventually rebelling against their employers altogether. They would worsen matters overall, bringing the empire back on its course to collapse. This distraction allowed the Ottomans to resume their conquest of Anatolia. In 1321, civil war broke out between Andronikos II and his grandson, which lasted until 1328, when his grandson, Andronikos III, emerged victorious. This had been a costly move for power, as the army was unable to stop the Turks from taking Nicomedia and Nicaea some years later. As usual, the other front of the empire was facing invasion as well. The Serbians seized the moment and began to invade the Balkans, eventually conquering much of Greece itself and separating Constantinople from its remaining territories in the Morea, shown here. Andronikos III died in 1341, and civil war broke out again for succession to the throne. Not long after, the Black Plague hit Europe and the empire. It is in the 1350s that we see the Roman Empire on its last legs. As mentioned, the empire consisted now of Constantinople, the immediately surrounding European land, and some territories which were semi-independent on account of the fact that the Romans could exert little strength over them. Rome's rivals watched events like vultures, awaiting the perfect opportunity to strike. It is in this time that the Ottomans began to cleverly move into Europe itself. When the Serbian Empire broke apart in 1355, it became clear who would hold power in the region. The Romans appealed to help from Western Europe, specifically the Pope, as they had once done some centuries before, but the West was rather unwilling to intervene. Over the course of the next few decades, the Ottomans pressed further and further into the Balkans, taking not simply Byzantine territory, but challenging and defeating the Serbs and Bulgarians as well. Constantinople persisted as a mere city-state with some territory in southern Greece, and by 1373, the Emperor John V was forced to become a vassal of the Ottoman Empire. The once great Emperor of Rome, now ruler of what was becoming a city-state, a shadow of its former self, and a vassal to Turkish invaders. When Emperor Manuel II came to the throne in 1391, the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid I informed him that he was emperor inside the city walls alone. However, Rome still lived, and would, for another half-century, but the Ottomans continuously eyed the grand prize, and soon they would strike. The Ottoman Turks would strike Constantinople multiple times over the course of the next few decades, but each of these sieges failed, largely because of distractions, such as crusades against them, the invasions of Tamerlane, and internal rebellions and civil wars. Yet, none of these could stop what was coming. In 1448, Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos came to the throne. A few years after, in 1451, the Sultan Mehmed II came to the throne of the Ottomans. 19-year-old Mehmed II had a great ambition. He began to prepare to take the city of Constantinople itself. In the spring of 1453, he struck. The Byzantines, with allies from various states in Italy, had around 7,000 troops. The Ottomans had about 10 times this. Generally, such a ratio was manageable, as the walls of the city were historically unbreakable. But alas, these were different times. This was an age when gunpowder was making its debut. While the walls of Constantinople were formidable, the Ottoman cannons proved to be a worthy challenger. The fighting would last for nearly 2 months. It was tough fighting, and the future remained unclear. As it became clearer, though, the Latins and Greeks set aside their differences for a moment and came together as Christians for a final ceremony in the Hagia Sophia. On May 29, 1453, the Ottomans finally managed to push through a breach in the wall. Panicked, many of the Byzantine and Italian soldiers began to flee. But the emperor, Constantine XI, famously tore off his royal attire so as to look like a common soldier and prepared for battle, saying, "The city is fallen, and I am still alive." Earlier, before this, he had rallied his forces with his speech, the last a Roman emperor would ever give to his people. He spoke of the great city of Constantinople. By now it was a shadow of its former self and had fallen into disrepair, but he reminded them that for a time, it held a known world under its grip. He spoke of their duty to Christ, to defend this great city against the Muslim invaders. Then he said to his men, "Consider then, my brothers and comrades in arms, how the commemoration of our death, our memory, fame, and freedom can be rendered eternal." What happened in these final moments is very unclear to history, but it is said that the emperor was last seen charging into the ranks of the Turks, fading into history. His body was never found. His men, the last of the Romans, soon followed him to this fate, bravely fighting and dying in the last stand of a civilization with roots stretching back over 2,000 years. To think, an ancient village on the coast of Italy could shape the world to this extent. It had all led to this. Mehmed captured Constantinople and made it his new capital. He allowed 3 days of sacking and pillaging. Constantinople's people were enslaved, deported, raped, and killed. The Turks plundered the city so severely that Mehmed himself was evidently moved to tears. "What a city we have given over to plunder and destruction," he said as he entered it 3 days later. The Hagia Sophia became a mosque. The city would later be known as Istanbul, though not officially until the 20th century, from the Greek Istimbolin, which simply meant "to the city." Constantine XI went down in history as a folk hero, saved by angels turned into marble and placed under a mountain, awaiting the day he could rise from the dead and restore the old empire. A handful of Byzantine rump states would hold out for a few decades after, though by the end of the 15th century, these too had fallen. And so, the history of Rome concluded on that morning of May 1453 AD. Bodies and blood were spilled across the city and surrounding area in what might have been an otherwise peaceful spring day in the heart of Eastern Rome. But was it really the conclusion? Frankly, can we look at the modern world and deny that Roman civilization still lives on? Immediately after this, many Byzantines fled west, including the Palaiologos family, which fled to England. Their mark can still be seen in how they influenced the Renaissance by bringing Westerners a knowledge of the ancient Greeks. But how could the great empire have met this fate? Where was the point of no return? When the British historian Edward Gibbon discussed the fall of the Western Roman Empire, he remarked that the story of its ruin is simple and obvious, and instead of inquiring why the Roman Empire was destroyed, we should rather be surprised that it had subsisted so long. The same can be said of the Eastern Roman Empire. It should have fallen multiple times in the past, but it held on, and not simply as a backwater existing for the sake of existing, but in many periods it was the envy of the world. In seeking an explanation, we can look to many of Byzantium's greatest emperors. Justinian I, Basil II, Alexios I, John II, and so on were not perfect, but they were lions in history, and their stories deserve to be told. But I believe furthermore, to truly understand Rome's success, we must look deeper. To the hard-working farmers, to the brave, selfless soldiers, to the mothers and fathers who raised these generations of Romans, to the priests, to the scholars and thinkers, to the common Roman, whose names were never written down. It is from these people, emperors and peasants, that we inherit all that the Roman Empire left us. And in our study of history, by seeing ourselves in these people, who are not so very different from us, we can perhaps learn to avoid their fate. And so we have concluded Part 2 of the Byzantine Empire documentary and Part 4 of the Roman Empire series. I hope you enjoyed it. If so, I invite you to come check out the rest of Fire of Learning and to subscribe to see more videos like this in the future. We would appreciate donations on Patreon to help with the cost of producing these videos, the link to which you can find in the description. You can support the channel with as little as a $1 contribution, however simply subscribing to our YouTube channel for free is also a large help. A special thanks to our Patreon supporters listed here. We are also on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, so come check us out there too. Evkaristo for watching.